Okay, so the title is Gardening in a Changing Climate and How We Can Adapt and Make a Difference. And I know a lot of people, this has been of interest to them for a very long time. So this will take about an hour, like I said. We're going to start today with a weather story. And you're wondering what weather has to do with it. But in August 2011, I think it was late August, we had a system that just got stuck over the Connecticut Valley. And it just dumped tons of rain on us, this whole region. Roads and bridges were washed out. We had homes destroyed, businesses obviously ruined. And if anybody was around then, that was Tropical Storm Irene. So that was a devastating storm, and we all know how devastating these storms can be. I think we had about 50 deaths, or right under 50 deaths. The damage estimates to that in the US was billions of dollars. So when these storms hit, such as Irene and even Superstorm Sandy, everybody remembers that one. And we even had one this week, actually, which I was just asking Leslie about, not as big as these others, but certainly devastating. We had power outages with Tropical Storm, Isaias, I think is what it was, knocked out like 3 million homes and businesses power along the East Coast. I think it triggered a lot of tornadoes. So it's not a superstorm, but it certainly impacts everyone. And so when it stalls over the region, it can be devastating. It doesn't even have to have tornadoes or hurricanes. So as we begin the presentation today, what kind of, and gardeners are such big observers. They observe the environment. They're just great at observing. Have you seen any different patterns of the climate, and what have you noticed in your own garden and yard as far as weather or climate in even just recently? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? And sometimes these changes are very slow, right? But have you and I've only been here 15 years, but I can certainly share some things that I've noticed, but I wanted to hear from you. Does anybody have any? Oh, okay. No?
I'm not really seeing anything personally, but I just know it's coming, so.
Well, so what about, one thing I've noticed is over the winters, a lot more rain instead of snow. So, yeah, so I mean, we used to have, when we first came, we had 3-4 feet of snow, and it stayed all winter. And now it's melting and rain's coming, and we've had no snow on our yard during the winter, and even in January. So that's one thing that I noticed, and it's kind of like, well, what's going on, right? Why is that happening? So, so one thing that I wanted to start with is, you're kind of wondering why I brought up these extreme weather events and what it really has to do with your garden. So one thing that climate change is putting in front of us is, how do we handle these extremes? We have extreme drought, and we have these downpours of water coming out of the sky. We have less snow in the winter. All of these climate change events make us have to rethink things as a gardener. And so I'll just go over some of the things that the scientist has observed. And this is backed up with scientific data. And one thing that they've noticed is that there's earlier leaf and bloom events. So even this year, we had a pretty early spring, except that we also had some winter storms while the spring was trying to get started. I kept wanting to go outside and do something, and then I'd get some snow on the ground. They've also, the damage, so when you start with early spring, and then you have these extreme winter events, whether it's snow or ice, whatever it may be, dropping temperatures, and you're gonna have some damage to that. Our non-native species, and especially our invasive species that are here, respond to these changes, and respond in not such a great way, for us anyway. They actually, as well as our insects, They grow more, they're here longer, and they just take over a little bit quicker. So, and this cold limitation intensifies their expansion. So, and it can cause a lot of damage to the plants as well. Another thing that we're seeing is species that interact with other species. So let's talk about migrating birds that come up, and they come back up here seasonally in March, let's say. But what if the food is not here for them because of that earlier spring? Everything's not synchronized like it has been. That can lead to some issues. Our plants, plants are responding, and certain plants like poison ivy are responding, ragweed are really responding and growing more and causing more problems. But all plants are going to have more pollen with the warmer weather. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to get into some scientific data, just real basic understanding of what's behind climate change and what it means, and a little bit of an explanation. I'm not a scientist, but I will do my best to explain it as simply as possible. And then from there, we're going to go into some climate smart gardening practices and what we can do in order to try to mitigate or adapt to these changes. So one thing that's important is the difference between weather and climate. So weather is really a very specific time frame. So it's a short time frame. It's a set of conditions at any given point. We can look out today and see whether the sun is shining or it's raining or whatever. That is kind of what the weather is doing today. And if you notice, the meteorologists probably predict weather out, 10 days? And then they change it every day or every hour as it goes along, and they learn more. So weather is a very kind of given in time, maybe a 2-week window of what they're anticipating the weather to be. Whereas climate is over a longer period of time. And it's usually on 30-year averages. And this, I think, is showing a lot more than that. But it's going to show the climate over those periods of decades, and it's all the elements. It goes through snow, any kind of precipitation, droughts. So they look at all different kinds of things with that climate. So what that means for us in this climate change, as the world gets a little warmer, and I'll show you some scientific data on that too, is that we're going to have to we've always paid attention to the last frost date in spring and the first frost date in the fall. I mean, as gardeners, that's what we do. So that's going to be something we're going to have to look at, because those frost-free days is actually getting longer. And for me, it was quite a difference. When I came from Texas, our growing season was, I don't know, 6 months out of the year, maybe. I mean, it was warm by February, warm enough to start planting, and it went well into the fall. And I came here and I couldn't plant until the end of May. And I had to get used to that. So it's also different in every region as well. So how the extreme weather events come into play is it does impact our climate. And then on a short term, obviously the weather is much different, much like we had just this week on, I think it was Tuesday that we had the storm come through. So a little bit of explanation about the greenhouse effect. We've all heard of that, and it's always been around. So that is nothing new. But we all know that the sun is our primary source of heat, obviously. It comes down into the earth, and we're cooler than the sun because we do live here, but the earth does emit energy back into the atmosphere. And this natural phenomena of all the gases, which you can see in the light blue section there, that's all of the gases and that are called the greenhouse gases. So every gardener knows about greenhouses, so it's kind of the same effect. So it goes back into the atmosphere and gets distributed. It warms our earth, it warms the oceans, and it's kind of actually that greenhouse gases are like a blanket around the earth. so that we can actually live here along with other living organisms such as plants and animals. So, if you want me to tell you all the gases, I can. Obviously, there's water vapor, carbon dioxide, which we're going to be talking quite a bit about, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. So all of that makes it livable for us. It's a blanket that keeps the earth at a temperature that we can live with. I hear all these little dings. I'm not sure what they are. So as human activities, we start burning fuel, the fossil fuels, and we have more transportation, we have more people, we have more transportations. All of this changes those concentrations of gases and make it a thicker blanket, if you can think of it that way. So that thickness of the blanket, and as it gets thicker, that is what traps more heat into our atmosphere and then leads to the warmer earth. So that's kind of where we are with that. And fossil fuels, we've always heard that is the largest, transportation is the largest source of that. And that just changed in 2012. That it took over as the #1 source of the heat trapping pollution. So global warming causes the climate to change. So that warming of the earth with that thick blanket that traps in all of the heat, or not all, but most of the heat, obviously causes warmer overall temperatures everywhere. Some places are all different, but it also, when you think about it, it changes the water cycle. Some places are going to have more rain, but some might have less. But you think about as it's heat and you feel the humidity in the air, that's evaporation of some of the water. So it's going to change our rain and water cycle and patterns that we have. It's warming our oceans, and we're going to talk a little bit about jet streams in a little bit. Melts our glaciers. I know you've all heard about that. And when those glaciers melt, the sea level's rising. So one piece of information I wanted to tell you about, I think I have it on another slide, is that Portsmouth, the sea level has risen like 6 inches. So that's quite a big change. It also, like we said, affects the plant growth, especially the ones that like carbon dioxide, our ragweed and our poison ivy, which are not 2 of our favorite things, certainly if you're allergic to them, but it's going to make a difference in all plant growth. So it changed around 1760 or so, when the Industrial Revolution came. That's when our climate started to change more, which is, if you think about it, we started having industrial revolutions. We had factories, cars, more cars were being, in this period, were being made, and we put all of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So and on the slide it says in the last 150 years, we've gone up 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in our air to 415. And I have a great chart to show you that'll help explain that. So this goes back 400,000 years. You can see the bottom shows 400,000 years. The yellow arrow is the Industrial Revolution, when it came around. 1760 to 1840 is kind of the general time frame. The left side is the carbon dioxide, which is parts per million by volume, so ppmv. So for the most part, you can see that the cycle is up and down throughout the 400,000 years, which is very natural. But it all stayed between the 180 and maybe 300 or so parts per million. And then we had the Industrial Revolution. So once it hit and we started putting more, human activities started actually putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then those parts per million of carbon dioxide just shot up to 415. And that's obviously, you can see that that's the most it has been in 400,000 years. That's pretty dramatic and a little scary all at the same time. And how this relates to warmer is, let me overlay the temperatures during that same time frame. And if you can look at that, how the temperature mirrors the carbon dioxide. So if carbon dioxide is lower, then the temperatures are lower. If the carbon dioxide is higher, the temperature is higher. So all of that makes a lot of sense. And so if we have more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, then we're going to have warmer temperatures. So then from the Industrial Revolution, which is the blue line up, once we had the factories and transportation, all the things that were putting more carbon dioxide into the air, it shot up to 415. So again, that means that we're going to have warmer temperatures. So that higher carbon dioxide in the air is warmer temperatures. And this chart's pretty straightforward. It just shows a little bit of the decades of warming, and obviously the last 30 to 40 years is a steady climb. You can see that from the 80s, 90s, and on up to today. It's just a steady increase. So those carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is just making it warm. Now, I guess one thing this year with the pandemic and people not on the roads for 2 or 3 months, and the airlines obviously quit most of their flights, buses weren't running, all of the things that were putting carbon dioxide in the air. I've tried to find something, they haven't really probably analyzed it yet to see if at least our Earth and our atmosphere got a little bit better during that 3-month time frame. Did you want to say something, Joy? I saw your hand go up.
I'll wait until we're at a question time, but I'm happy to address like what COVID is doing.
Okay, good.
To all
good.
of this.
That's great, because I couldn't find anything specific. So, okay, so then the jet stream is a very important piece of this. So it's exhibiting pretty extreme behavior. And just to let you know, the jet stream is a fast-flowing, narrow air current that's in the atmosphere on the Earth. And it might be on other planets too, but obviously we're only interested in the Earth right now. So it's not only changing because of the warmth, which is a big part of it, but also the Arctic is warming faster than the mid-latitudes. So when you think about it, you can see Arctic air. I hope you can see this well enough. The Arctic air in the mid-latitudes, the way we decide the jet stream or the jet stream functions is the difference between those two, the contrast between cold air and the warm air of the mid-latitudes. And it used to obviously be a bigger contrast. So now that contrast is getting smaller. So the Arctic air is warmer and it's getting closer to the mid-latitude. So that jet stream is slowing down because of that. And that's when, like I said about Irene, it gets stalled. So part of that stalls some of these different storms that are coming through. And these peaks and troughs are a little more wavy because of that. And in the winter, in the summer, it holds more moisture, and that's when you get these current hurricanes and all these rainfall. In the polar vortex is the winter, where things stall and you have bigger storms for that. And if we don't do something, they've predicted it's going to increase by 50% this century. And then what is going to happen? We've already seen quite a bit that's happened relating to that. A little closer to home is our own Gulf of Maine. So this particular, as you can see, the ocean circulation is something we don't necessarily see, just like the jet stream, but it's in the ocean. So, and this is, I think, observed since, 1870, the currents in the Atlantic Ocean. So the Gulf Stream, if you look on the right bottom and the red air and the arrow with with this ribbon, I'm going to call it a ribbon, that has an arrow in it going up, it starts warm water and it's on the surface because warm water stays more on the surface. It finds its way up to the Arctic where it supposedly hits colder water and usually does. And it cools, but it also gets saltier. And then as it gets saltier and colder, it's more dense. It's to the bottom of the ocean. So that's normally what happens. And then it travels back down and you can see as it turns red and then it turns blue as it goes back down, and it should be cold, salty water that's on the bottom of the ocean when it goes back down the blue ribbon. So, but the things that are changed is the Arctic, as we had mentioned, the Arctic sea ice is melting, Greenland's ice sheets are melting. So what they do, they're making those currents less salty. And when they're less salty and they're not as cold, they're going to stay higher in the ocean and not quite to the surface, but they're not going to be quite as deep. So when it gets to the part of New Hampshire, this part of the Gulf of Maine, it's going to linger in the Gulf of Maine a little bit longer because it's a little more sluggish. And it's the Gulf of Maine, believe it or not, is warming 7 times faster than the rest of the ocean. So, and that is just in the last 15 years, but it's because of that, the ice sheets in the Arctic melting and not being as cold that's driving that warmth. So I found that pretty fascinating myself. So one thing that we've noticed just ecologically, some of the patterns and what the scientists have discovered is obviously an increase in precipitation in all of it. We have more of it, we have it more often, and it's more intense. Our average temperatures have increased. So in the winter, since 1970, we've increased by 4 degrees. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it can make a big difference. Those extreme weather events have been increasing. Our seasons have changed. Like we said, we might have earlier springs and later autumns, which means we have more of a growing season. We have more rain in the winter instead of snow. And then the sea level is in Portsmouth, yes, 6 inches, has risen 6 inches since 1926. So in 100 years, it has risen quite a bit. We also have more summer drought, which I've also noticed as well. So the other thing that it impacts is things outside of that, which is like our animals that are terrestrial animals. I don't know if you have heard this, but there is a concern for our moose because of our winters not being as cold as they were. It's not killing off the ticks. So I think they're called winter ticks. I'm not sure if they're the same kind, but our moose are birthing little moose during the winter, and those ticks are getting on those little, the babies, and actually they're not surviving that. It's pretty fatal. The other thing, this is a woodcock, which if they come back too early, like we mentioned, and the food source is not there for them, that can be pretty dramatic for that species. Our ocean species, they're getting impacted as well. When you think about that warming of the Gulf of Maine, cod and lobster like it cold. So they're moving north, which is could impact us in a lot of different ways. The shrimp are collapsing because of that warmer water. The clams and anything with shells is being impacted by that warmer water. They need that cold, salty water to actually be successfully and healthy. The other thing that's impacted is kind of, I guess I'd call it tourism. So we always love for people to come up and enjoy New Hampshire as much as possible. Skiing could be impacted. I know that a lot of the ski resorts are having to make their own more snow earlier because we're not getting as much snow and it's not staying on the ground as much. Our snowmobiling is the same way. Maple syrup, I think, has been impacted a lot by that because that's a very specific timing for tapping maple syrup. And tourism, just general tourism. And we've already mentioned this, but the ragweed pollen and the poison ivy both love CO2. And they will grow bigger. They will be more toxic and obviously more irritating to anyone that's has allergies for either one of those. But the more CO2, then the bigger these plants are going to be and the more irritating they will be for us. Not for them, but for us. They'll grow bigger. Okay, so at this point, that's a little bit of the basics of the science and kind of the impact of that global warming and the climate change. And we can stop for questions. Joy, do you want to go ahead and explain? Yeah.
Well, first, let me say a couple people checked in about their experience of climate.
Okay.
That Leslie said she's still learning about this climate, but has been surprised by hot, dry weather in early spring and also the heavy rain events. And Declan said he's only been here, he or she, sorry, Declan, didn't see a video. You've only been here 3 years and every year has been unique. And then Dale did have a question. I think it goes back to one of your slides asking what is the infrared line and what that represents. I don't know if you want to zip, if you know what slide that is and if you want to zip back there.
I don't know what's the infrared line is that.
In the meantime, I'll just put up, what I'll do is in the chat, I'll put a link to a website that I think is, whoops, that's not it. That's the login for the meeting. Let me try that again. COVID's long-term effects. No. Okay.
So I'm not sure, that infrared line that was showing, I think it was on the greenhouse effect, which is as the earth emits energy back into the atmosphere, it's infrared radiation that goes back, and those are the wavelengths.
Right.
So I think that might be the one that he was referring to.
Okay, yeah, usually infrared radiation is what's radiated back from objects on the ground. So if you're, for instance, my patio is stone and it heats up in the sun, and then that heat gets radiated back at nighttime. So I had been trying to put up my umbrellas during the day on these hot days to reduce that heating, knowing that it's going to continue to heat the air around the house at night. So I've just posted a link to a site. Columbia University has some really good resources on keeping up with climate change and information on progress around climate change science and climate change activity. And so this particular blog is nice because it is very holistic. It looks at the things that kind of negatively can impact our progress. So the slowdown in terms of meetings, the diversion of money away from resilience and climate action and climate research. And then it also gets into some of the positives, people getting more accustomed to meeting online, more people riding their bicycles and things. So I can refer you specifically to that blog on that topic, but they're also, if you poke around on their site, they have a really good set of resources that I think are accessible to people. I follow something called the Climate Deregulation Tracker. It's more about politics and regulations, but it's how regulations over the last 4 years have been kind of lightened up, or targets have been changed. So for example, we were on target to change the mileage standards for automobiles, and that's been changed. And so if you're more interested in the political side of it, that's a place to go to find out what's actually happening in the political arena in terms of our country. But it's a very readable blog, and it has some nice pictures.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? You can raise your hand if your video is on. I'll see it. I'm sort of scanning. If you scroll down to your toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little word bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, you can type in a question. And if it takes you a while to do that, that's fine. We'll have more time for questions and we can get to your questions later too. And if you want to just speak up, you can look for the little microphone, little red microphone with a slash through it. Click on that to unmute yourself. Sandra, it looks like we're good. The dings that were happening earlier is good news. It was just people jumping on the call. So
Okay, yeah, I
have
couldn't
more
tell.
people than before.
Okay. Like walking in a room, except now they're dinging into a room, right? So did you want to talk about the impact of the COVID now? Oh, you're muted. Oops.
Yeah, I was just referring people to the
You just
blog.
want to read. Okay,
Yes.
just read the blog.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Excellent.
It's a long story.
It's a long story. Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
it is. I just didn't know if any analysis had been done. Obviously, it's relatively current.
Well, yeah,
so.
the blog starts with this information, and you want to imagine the carbon in the atmosphere in terms of a bathtub, right? So there's water in a bathtub. There's also water flowing in from the faucet. If you have the faucet on, that would be our carbon emissions. And there's a drain, and that would be things that we do to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So the good news is that we cranked the faucet down a little bit in terms of emissions during COVID. However, even though April was a lower month for emissions, May was still the highest month on record for the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere, because once the carbon gets in there, it stays there for 100 years. So in order to impact carbon change, we need to both ramp down on our emissions and think about doing things as gardeners that will absorb more carbon from the atmosphere.
Okay, and that's a great segue because we're about to go into that part of it. So, so the question is, what practices can we implement in our gardens to make a difference? So that's kind of the whole thing that we're doing here. So there's what's called climate smart practices. And I have to believe as gardeners that you're all probably doing something. There's a lot we can do. And I think gardeners are just intuitive and they're observers, and they're also take on challenges pretty well. So I think you're probably doing some things already. So one thing just to bring to mind, and you probably know this, but everyone should use the Plant Hardiness Zone Map. We have a relatively new one, 2012, I guess 8 years ago is pretty new. But in this new map, generally, pretty much throughout the US, all of the zones went up 1/2 zone warmer than the previous map. So that's why it came out. And the one thing to be mindful of is, again, those edges of the seasons, those frost dates that we've talked about, and watch those. And even if you plant early before those frost dates, then you may have to cover them up or protect those plants. So that's obviously something, and we're always aware of that. We're always watching that. I'm always running outside at the last minute covering up plants or something. So just be aware and make sure that you're using the 2012 Hardiness Zone Map when you're doing that. So the next section is actually sustainable garden practices. And this is where the handout that I talked about, the climate, let me see, make sure it's called that, Climate Smart Gardening Audit. So everything that's on that handout is what we're going to go through. So as we go through it, just in your mind, kind of think about and maybe even check off what things you're doing already, because I'm pretty sure that you're already doing some of these things. And then we can have a discussion about that at the end of this section. We'll have some questions. So the 6 areas are the organic material. and how you manage that. We have our soil that we have to watch after, water, pollinator protection, and garden design and plant selection, which I used to always start there, but I now realize that that's not the place to start. It might be the fun place to start, but it's not the place to start. And then a little bit about what we call inputs, which are equipment and material selection for your garden. So we're going to go through each one of these a little bit more detail. So organic material, I'm almost certain that you all know what that is, but that's just the plant residue that's left. So whether it's grass clippings, it's pruning, it's pulling plants out because they died, weeds, whatever it may be. It's also your plant-based kitchen waste could be organic. And all of those materials are carbon-based compounds. So they're part of that carbon cycle, as Joy was talking about. There's inputs and outputs, right? So what the plants do is they take in that carbon into their tissues, and they convert it into carbohydrates, starches, sugars, whatever it takes for their tissues to survive. And then as probably you pull up some of that vegetation at the end of the season and leave it on the ground or not, grass you might leave on the ground, then that carbon goes into the soil. And we're going to find out about soil and how it keeps that carbon within itself. So mulching leaves, grass clippings, leave them in place. It's good for the soil. It's good for everything. Compost your yard plant waste. And then if you want to get into it, also your plant food waste, and it only needs to be from the kitchen, your plant food waste, so your vegetables and fruits and stuff. If you use compost and it's not your own compost, you know exactly what you put in it, so you know that it's clean. Just be careful about compost if you're going to buy it from someone else, and ask where they get it from. Make sure there's not anything in there that is going to cause problems within your soil and your plants. Not everybody is as clean a composter as you will be. So, so you might just want to ask a few questions about that. So the soil, now the soil is, we all know the value of the soil and how well that helps with our health of our plants. But some of the things that we can do that are climate smart is grow different plants. And one thing to think about, again, I'll just use myself as an example. I used to always think about, I'm going to put in a flower garden. I'm going to put in a vegetable garden here, and be very, I guess, silo or a tunnel vision about that particular garden. And in reality, when you look in the ecosystems on the earth, they actually they're not that specific when they're doing it, right? So if you plant a tree, it does more than just give you shade. You might plant it because it's shade, but what else does it do? It feeds the animals. It gives them shelter, a place to make their nest. It does more than one thing. So all the natural ecosystems actually have a lot of function to them, other than maybe what we're thinking about. So when you're thinking about plants and gardens and yards, think about it as a holistic approach, I guess, as opposed to just a single flower garden. But look a little bit further than that, and look a little bit further than just the plants. But growing different plants helps the soil. Rotating those crops, I know if you're a vegetable gardener, you know that rotating crops to make sure that whatever's in the soil, for, like, let's say tomatoes, rotate those so that whatever, if that fungus was getting to them this year, let's put them someplace else. So let's make sure that that fungus doesn't keep attacking our tomatoes. We integrate some things that are great nitrogen, which are beans and peas. That helps that soil, health of that soil, and provides nutrients. One thing, I'm sure you've all done it, is keep your soil covered. We want to keep that soil covered. I look at the places that I don't have covered, and they're drying up and they're not looking so good, and that's where the weeds come in and other things that you don't want. So always keep your soil covered. Try not to compact the soil very much. So big equipment, is always kind of bad for soil. It compacts it. And if it's not aerated, then it can't, what we would call breathe. Use cover crops if you have to. And cover crops are great, not only just to cover the soil, but also to bring some nutrients into that soil as well. So, let's see, I think that's always, so basically what it's saying is always have plants growing and don't show the soil. We want to keep that soil covered at all times. Another thing that makes good practice, and we're going to talk about this some more, is native plants obviously are much easier to maintain in the soil than your invasive or some of your non-natives. The other thing which is new, and I just actually learned that this year, is to actually till or turn your soil less. I had always learned that you soil it a lot. You put in whatever your compost is every year or whatever nutrients you need to add, and you till it. And now they're saying that really it's better to till it less or turn the soil less. You're going to have to do some if you add compost or nutrients to the soil, but minimize that tilling of the soil. We always like to see earthworms, obviously, and the better the soil, the more earthworms you're going to have, so that's great. I'm going to skip a couple, but one thing is to know what your pH is for your soil so that you know what kind of nutrients are in there, and then you match the nutrients with the plant nutrients needs. So testing for soil, and every time you do vegetable garden or any kind of garden, where you're planting should have a soil test. And you should know what that is. And the UNH extension, I don't think they've opened it back up yet, but they do have soil testing available when they open it back up, and they can give you the pH, and they can also do what's nutrients. So before you put any extra supplemental things into the soil, be sure to know what's there first, and then what plants you're going to plant, what their needs are, and make sure that that matches. Most of the time, the three things that you do have in the soil, one of them is nitrogen, because the plants use a lot of nitrogen. So just make sure that you add nitrogen, but only for the plants that need more nitrogen. So you need to kind of know what you have in your soil and what nutrients are there. Water management. So this is a fun one. So one thing about your site is it's very different than maybe my site. So understanding what your garden's requirements are for water is very important. You can watch where water pools possibly. You can watch where it drains fast. You can figure out where the different places are, and then plant the plants that are suited to that condition, because you can't always change those conditions, but you can plant plants that are suitable for that. And all plants need varying waters, obviously. I would group plants that need similar water needs together, so that if you mix the plants that some need less water than others, then they could have too much or too less water, and that's not good. So if you can try to understand the plant's needs for water and group those accordingly. Obviously observations, again, I say gardeners are observers, so always just keep observing your plants and the rainfall and what it does before you add irrigation. So if you have to do any kind of supplemental watering, just be careful you're not doing it for everything, the same for everything. I know in Texas, I haven't seen it up here. In Texas, every house was built with an automatic irrigation system. People would turn it on weekly or every other day. They would leave it and never think about it again. And we would see a lot of rain runoff because of that. So it'd be raining and they'd still have the irrigation system would be going. So we don't want that. We want to use our water a little bit more climate smart. So if you can use rain barrels and catch that rain, that would be a great way to do it instead of using your potable water. If you have surface runoff on your property, and every property is different, then think about installing a rain garden. They're wonderful. And if you want to know more about rain gardens, if you haven't heard of those, it's really, instead of building up the soil, you're actually putting in a swell, I think is what they call it, a depression in the ground where the water can go and absorb into the soil. And Soak Up the Rain New Hampshire is an excellent resource for that. You can see it right there in the middle of the bottom there. They have a great website. They'll tell you exactly how to install it and what it's for. You have quite a few for those who live in Keene. You have, I think, 2 at the Keene Rec Center. You have 1 there at the library, I'm sure Gail knows about. There's some along, I think it's Washington Street. And you may not recognize them as rain gardens because they pretty much look like every other garden. But there are some rain gardens because of some of the surface runoff that they've had some trouble with there in Keene. But you can also do it at your home. Protection of pollinators. So this is a big one. And one thing, let me see if I can find, I had some data on this. I think 80% of the world's flowering plants rely on pollinators for successful reproduction. So what we need to do is make sure that we're putting in plants that attract the pollinators. And really what they do is obviously get that pollination from same species to species to make sure that the reproduction of the flowers or fruit or whatever it may be can actually be productive. So think about, they always say, think about color every season. So always have something blooming every season. So then you have a variety of pollinators that come in. Try not, if you must, that's okay, but try to avoid pesticides. That's not good for pollinators, obviously. If you can use an integrated pest management approach, which is relative, I don't know if it's relative, but it's kind of new, I guess, but it's a scientific-based, sustainable way to deal with pests that we have. And it takes into account that we have to keep our beneficial pests and get rid of the ones that are really an issue. So if there's different ways of getting, whether it's cultural, biological, or other ways than chemical to do that, and before you use pesticide, make sure you know what pest that you are actually trying to get rid of, because you don't want to get rid of the bees and the butterflies and all the ones that are pollinating. That integrated pest management is a great approach, and the UNH Extension, Co-op Extension, has some excellent information on that. And I'm sure that's in the resource material as well. One thing to think about is beekeeping. So we've heard stories over many years about certain bees that are endangered, or the killer bees that are coming to take over, right? I mean, there's both sides. But bees are very important to pollinating and obviously making honey as well. So one thing to be a sustainable gardener is, if you were interested, start being a beekeeper, which is great. Okay, garden design. And this is probably one thing I know more about than anything. But again, understand where you are, your site, and your regional climate. We're in kind of a humid, I think it's continental climate. So we have these warm, obviously warm, humid summers, and then these cold, snowy winters. So although we have these weather events that happen, our climate is still that. So, so make sure you choose plants that are suited to your conditions, whatever they may be on your site. Try to do native plants, which would be great. That diversity of the plants is a great thing. Recognize, and please don't plant invasive species. The little red circle with the X through it is loosestrife. So there's also a list on the UNH Extension of what they consider to be invasive plant species. So you might want to pull that down. And if you don't want to pull them up, that's fine if you already have them, but try not to go and be proactive and plant them, because they really do take over. And like we said with the CO2 in the air, some of them just love that and respond in a big way. So let's try not to have those invasive species around. So let's see if there's anything else. Oh, the other thing to think about when I was thinking about those silos of gardens, if you think about, can this particular plant, such as in the left corner, bottom corner, can, not only is that a pretty plant for you, but it's also providing food for maybe some animals out there. So think about it as not just one function, but that it could actually be more. So. And then the inputs, this is quite an interesting one, but we spend, as Americans, we certainly spend a lot on our lawns and gardens. And one thing I know my husband loves all the tools and the big tools and the plows and all the big stuff. So one thing is we have become dependent on that. Americans spend a lot of money on their gardens to keep them pretty. But a lot of those tools and products also contribute to the greenhouse gases. So obviously one of them is our gas-powered mowers, whether it's a big one or a small one. So I understand that our properties, my property is, and I'm sure some of you have large pieces of property that really do need mowing, and that's really the most appropriate way to do it. So if that's the case, then just make sure it's serviced and that the blades are sharp, so that it's not there's not contributing to the carbon as much. So if it's in good condition and sharp blades, then it does, I think it's 20%, reduces the gas consumption up to 20%. So that's important to remember. Always ask yourself, do I really need that new purchase? I'm probably one of those people that just likes gadgets. Whether it's kitchen gadgets or garden gadgets, right? I just love them. But maybe I don't need as many as I think I do. So just think about it, and think about if you already have something existing that would work as well. So we just need to minimize all of that. And just think about the carbon footprint any of these materials or tools are going to take up. And obviously, always buy local when you can. That's one thing that I think is good for everybody. So I think, mowing. I think the one other thing on mowing is you don't necessarily have to mow every week. So in the growth season, mowing every 5 to 7 days probably makes sense. But we were just in a drought. I think it was in June as opposed to July, but June, our grass just stopped growing and went, I guess I would call it dormant. You don't really need to mow then. So it's just be observant, watch it, and mow it when it needs mowing. And you can leave it a little bit higher and leave the clippings in there. So I know that was a fast overview of all of that, but are there any questions?
So there's been some discussion in the chat today. Again, other concerns about having decks or patios that are really hot and worrying about the pot plants out there. I know I found it really hard to keep up with potted plants this summer in those heat waves.
Yes.
Dale's reminding us that UMass Extension Soil Testing Lab has reopened. The UNH lab has not yet opened. When I did call them, because I was a very good doobie and sent in soil samples this year, right before everything shut down. But what they recommended is that if they're not open by fall, to take soil samples before the ground freezes. So then if they open over the winter, I already have the soil collected, labeled, and dried and ready to go.
And they have very specific directions on how to do that online. So check those, right?
Yep, I put that website in the chat. So someone's asking what you recommend for a cover crop.
Oh, cover crops. Cloves are good. Any kind of crop that provides nitrogen And I do think also on the unit extension, they also have a pretty good list of what crop covers would be. Clover, which I have clover growing naturally, so, but I know that that's one of them. And I can't think of anything right off, but I think if you do some research on unit extension, whether it's Massachusetts or New Hampshire, I think they would have some good ideas for where you are that would work.
I used a cover crop in my raised bed for the first time last year. I have
Yeah.
four 4x8 raised beds, and I put cover crop seed in 2 of them, and then one of them I mulched pretty heavily, so the crop kind of got buried in the fall. The other one, I have to say, it was the most active bed for birds all winter, that it continued to be green and growing through the snow. And I had trouble kind of getting to stop growing when I planted. And it was a mix, I think, of a winter rye and vetch. And the Cheshire County Conservation District was providing free cover crop seeds to home gardener through their library seed library
Nice.
last year. So I kind of jumped on that. I don't know if they're going to do that this year, but I will find out from Rachel Bryce. And when I talk about putting your garden to bed in 2 weeks, I'll make sure to have a recommendation from her.
Excellent, excellent.
Other questions? Let's see. Anybody else? Hands up if you want to wave, or if you go to participants on your toolbar, you can, there's even a little hand you can put up that we can see, or you can just type into chat. Again, you kind of have to scroll your cursor around to find these. I find it very difficult to do this when I'm on Zoom on my phone, but we'll, I guess we're about wrapping up. We can always email the library and they'll pass questions along.
Yeah.
Do you have an email list, and can you remind us about upcoming lectures? Like, you know, keep us on an email list, or should we just keep an eye on Facebook, which is where I found this?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Right. So this was shared on Facebook. If you go to the Keene Public Library website, you'll see the next talk already up there, and you can register for it under the adult learning programs. Or Gail, if you'd like to, I'm not sure who asked the question. Was that?
Well, we do have an email list, and you will get, I can put that link to get that in the chat. If you sign up for that, you'll get all of our programs, not just the gardening ones, though. But, you know, there might be other things that you want. Let me see, here it is.
Yeah, we're also trying to push it out through the New Hampshire Master Gardeners. And I think the Facebook site was probably the New Hampshire Master Gardeners site.
No,
but
the library had an ad. We had an ad.
Great.
And we also had an event, and that I think you guys shared, but let me get it here. If you wanted to sign up to, there's a link right there to put your name on the email that the library does of all of our programs. While I'm talking, I could mention too that the library, Joy mentioned that the seed library, we have live seeds that we provide to people, and also we have tools. So like if you were really motivated and you didn't want to buy some tools to eliminate some purchases, you can borrow a lot of the tools that you might need for gardening.
It's great to have a library that's supporting the gardening. And it's a great way for people that just want to try things out to get started without having to make a big investment.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, that looks like it,
Okay.
Sandra.
Okay, so let's go on. We just have a little bit more to go. I don't know why it's not going. There it is. Okay. So one of the things that the question is kind of, we talked about what are your current actions that you're already doing in your garden. And I know that you probably all have some. So if you just take a minute, and I know we went through all 6 categories and it probably was a little fast, but if you look at the handout that's called Climate Smart Gardening Audit, which hopefully you can see on the screen, these are all of the things and maybe some added ones that we just went over. So just for your fun, I guess, just kind of determine how many you already do, because I know you probably already do quite a few of these. And maybe you don't know that it fit into one of these climate smart gardening practices, but it does. So if you compost, you're already making a difference. So all of these things are what we can do to make a difference. So first of all, just put, what are your current practices? Think about those and which ones you're doing. And then as you think about going forward and maybe taking more action, think about maybe 1 or 2 that you might want to add to that list. And maybe you've never, like Joy, just did the crops, cover crops last year or this year. So that's an addition that you could try, especially if someone gives you free seeds. It makes it really easy to do. So just take a few minutes and go through those in a more concise way instead of presentation style. And you can do this afterwards, but just think about it. And really what we want you to do is start thinking about these practices and making a difference. So just take a couple of minutes to do that. And if anybody wants to share out about what they currently do, or some things that brought to mind as you went through all of this, some things that you want to do maybe this year or next year to add to that list of climate smart practices, we would love to hear that.
So Leslie had shared that she's learned how important leaving debris is so that pollinators can overwinter successfully. They've started mowing their fields in mid-spring rather than fall. And she says, we leave the leaves. I'm a little conflicted because I'm giving this talk on putting your garden to bed in a couple of weeks. And the presentation that I'm using starts out with saying, get everything out of the garden, and clean up the debris so the pests don't have a place to hang out. So I'm going to have to do some research to figure out how to balance those. Yes. I covet the mowing of the leaves with the grass in the fall. I want that stuff for my garden beds. I don't want to leave it on the lawn.
And it's good for both, actually. So, right. Okay. So the next thing is, and all of this that we've been talking about, haven't used the words too much, but is the whole thing about the climate change and gardening is how we can reduce our fossil fuel use. And gardeners can certainly do that. One of them is, remember that the soil is the keeper of carbon. So if you don't till it too much, you're not releasing carbon. If you don't use gas-powered tools as much, obviously that helps. If you're close to town and you can walk or ride your bike into town instead of a car, obviously that helps as well. The other one is adaptation. So we have to be a little more proactive with our current practices and then come up with maybe some future things that we want to do. And if you want to get involved with policies, and if you have a business and how you operate, and anything, and it's not just one or the other that we do, mitigation or adaptation, we actually need to do both. I mean, that's what it's going to take to really make a difference on how we're doing things. So one thing is, when I showed the charts and the science data, it obviously, and then obviously what Joy was saying about the COVID impact on carbon, it doesn't sound very hopeful, but as we all know, gardeners are very hopeful people. So one thing that we have done is we've already met environmental challenges in the past. We've done quite a few. And we have addressed smog 45 years ago, which some of us were around then. We were all concerned about smog and obviously the pollutants that it put into the air. And we knew that it was a big challenge. But what we did was we, as a whole, working together, came up with what's called catalytic converters for our cars and vehicles. And we were able to reduce that smog by 30 to 50%. So, you know, it was a big challenge, but everybody got together, and it's hard to think about that, especially when we're looking at tighter budgets and cost rising on things. It's always hard to find a solution, but we did for smog. Another thing 35 years ago, when remember we were so concerned about we were just causing destruction to our ozone layer. And one of the things we came up with was to phase the chlorofluorocarbon, CFCs, I think I would call it, out. And actually that's where an international agreement came together over that. So this wasn't just America. This was international community came together to address this ozone layer destruction. They came up with an agreement where everybody agreed to phase out the CFCs. And at this time, through that agreement, pretty much all have been eliminated, and it's slowly, the ozone layer is slowly rebounding. So that's really good news. One more, which was just 30 years ago, is acid rain. And I remember that kind of scared me when I heard those words, but because it sounds pretty bad, but it was threatening our forest and our lakes. And so one of the things they came up with, most of these emissions was sulfur dioxide, and it was more from the utilities that were emitting emission for them, and that's what was causing it. So by cutting those emissions, again, finding where it came from and focusing on utilities, they reduced it by 50%, and we're slowly recovering from that. So as a whole, all together, when everybody works together, it's amazing what we can do. And all of three of these things, when all the reports come back and said they achieved all of these solutions in a far less cost than they thought and quicker than they anticipated. So that's encouraging that when we work together, we can actually get a lot done. I think we've shown that even through COVID-19, when we all work together and do the right thing for everyone, that it works. So these are just a few of them that we can meet the challenge. So we can certainly meet the challenge of climate change through personal things within your garden. And then if you get involved in policies and other business operations or anything else, that you can spread the news about how to help that. So you notice that Gardeners is in green because we actually are the people that are out there front observing and making adjustments. We always experiment and adjust in our gardens when we see changes and different patterns. So it takes us all, takes a community, as we've always said, for everything. That's pretty much the presentation. There's more work to do, but we can do it. And I just hope that the presentation has given you some things to think about, some things to actually take steps and do some more actions. Well, thank you for everyone's time. I appreciate you spending an hour or so with us today. And I hope we got you thinking about some good stuff.